As Deputy Director of the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art, I feel honored to welcome the first Southern Theory lecture in our premises, and I thank the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology and the Leibniz Institut Leibniz Zentrum Moderner Orient for the organization of this important event. It is yet another step on the way to the research campus in Dahlem, which is in the process of being established in these museum buildings in cooperation between diverse partners such as museums, research institutions, libraries, and the Free University. Even before the first structural changes in these buildings will take place, occasions like this one show the potential of the coming Center for Object-Based Research. The Research Campus Dahlem will always be open and provide a stage for critical voices to present a wide overview of the debates which are, for example, emerging from the object collections that are housed in these buildings. Not only since the so-called restitution report of Monsieur Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy, the public interest in the future of ethnological collections has increased. For the museums, the new approach to collections bears many positive side effects and positive potential. In their report, Sarr and Savoy state that the discussion about restitution not only leads into the past. I cite, "It becomes a question of building bridges for future equitable relations." For this purpose, we're glad to now have permanently 4 provenance researchers, 2 of which currently deal with African collections, 1 with Asian collections, and 1 with collections from the Americas, to prepare for the increasing number of requests from the Global South in connection to the collections. Furthermore, new and active cooperation projects have been established with colleagues from Namibia, Tanzania, North America, India, etc. Currently, we minister one temporary cooperation project with local experts from Amazonian in South America, but we will soon create a permanent position for the cooperation with communities from the regions of origin to establish joint research links on a long term. In our museum routine, we already had the chance to learn that restitution is not necessarily the end of a dialogue, but can instead become the start of a new form of relationship. After a restitution of objects in May 2018, for example, we were revisited 2 weeks ago by the Chugach group from Alaska to work together on the remaining collections. We have to keep in mind, however, that the scope of the underlying problem is much bigger. As the report of Sarr and Savoy illustrates as well, the discussion about objects can only be part of a larger process of dealing with the colonial past. This reaches beyond the walls of museum buildings and addresses the society as a whole. A much wider decolonization process has to take place, and that is why we are here today. I now look forward to the presentation of Monsieur Sarr and hand over to Professor Dilger from the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology for further introducing remarks. Thank you very much and welcome again.
Thank you. Esteemed guests, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the first Berlin Southern Theory lecture with Professor Felwine Sarr tonight. This lecture was organized jointly by the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology of Freie Universität Berlin and the Leibniz Zentrum Moderner Orient, and in close cooperation with the Staatliche Museen zu Berlin of the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz. We are very happy that the inaugural event of this new lecture series has sparked so much interest and that so many of you have followed our invitation to engage with new ways of thinking knowledge production about and from the African continent in today's post-colonial context. Social and cultural anthropologists from Germany and especially Northern Europe, in German Ethnologinnen und Ethnologen or Sozial- und Kulturanthropologinnen, have been central for envisioning and describing the African continent and what is today called the Global South in general in the colonial context, together with researchers, travelers, and museum or other collectors from other area-related disciplines. Much of the research and knowledge production that have been carried out during this time continue to shape the ways in which academia, museums, and the media, and the public at large, perceive of and relate to countries, societies, institutions, and people in and from the so-called Global South until today. They also continue to inform the political conditions and realities which configure and sustain the relationships between the above-mentioned groups and entities across the highly problematic and simultaneously stubbornly persistent boundaries between what we understand conventionally as the Global South or Global North. At the same time, however, both scholars and researchers and in universities and other institutions, as well as activists and representatives of various civil society initiatives, strive for new approaches for knowledge production in collaboration with thinkers and intellectuals working from and about the Global South in an interconnected world. It is only in this way that we may be able to arrive at a more symmetrical relationship or relationships and eventually structural foundations of knowledge production that we need so urgently for entering into multi-perspectival discussions about the most pressing challenges of the contemporary world. It is the aim of this lecture series to make a continuous contribution to these larger endeavors, and the Forschungscampus or Research Campus that was mentioned by Alexis von Poser in his words of welcome aims to become the host and also a motor for these much needed encounters and conversations. Against this background, I wish all of us an interesting and inspiring evening, and now hand over to my colleague, Professor Sandra Calkins from the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology of Freie Universität, who is going to introduce the ideas and aims of the Berlin Southern Theory Lecture. Thank you and welcome again.
So why do we need a Southern Theory Lecture in Berlin? Now, debates on the geopolitics of knowledge production, of course, aren't new. And we've had decades of subaltern and post-colonial critiques. Yet if we look at what actually has changed in the organization of academic theorizing, we realize it is not that much. We further find ourselves here in Berlin tonight, roughly 135 years after the Berlin Africa Conference, that entered collective memory as the moment where the colonial powers subdivided the African continent amongst themselves. And isn't it strange that many humanities, and especially the social sciences, emerged in the past 150 to 200 years at this moment when Europe was busy colonizing the world? Though the world has become multicentric in many ways, theory making arguably has not. In many social sciences and humanities, we're still largely operating with a relatively narrow set of Euro-American theories and concepts to interpret this changing world. And the canon of what needs to be known in many disciplines still rarely includes voices outside of Euro-American academy. So the Berlin Southern Theory Lecture that we are instituting today, as the first of a series of annual events, really seeks to contribute to tackling lingering hierarchies in the academic knowledge production, and that head on. So recognizing the need to shift perspective and to diversify the geopolitical and social locations we think from, this lecture series offers a prominent stage to Southern thinkers and theorists. Now, importantly, with Southern theory, we don't necessarily mean theory from a specific place, but rather we treat the South or the Southern as a signifier that indicates a relation, and specifically a somewhat eccentric location vis-a-vis Euro-American theory making. So here we see an opportunity to think with propositions about the world that depart from our own, that can enrich our understanding of the contemporary, and from where we can jointly devise other ways of being in and doing the world. So we thus believe the Southern Theory lecture has a crucial role to play in building on previous conversations around decolonizing knowledge and also anchoring them firmly within the academic landscape of Berlin. And we're, of course, very honored that Felwine Sarr accepted our invitation to open this lecture series with his talk, Rewriting the Humanities from Africa for an Ecology of Knowledge. And now my colleague Kristina Mashimi from the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology will introduce our speaker to you.
Yeah, so now it's my very big pleasure, but as Sandra said, also a big honor to actually introduce our speaker of the first Berlin Southern Theory lecture to you, Professor Dr. Felwine Sarr. Felwine Sarr is a scholar, a writer, a musician. As a professor, he currently teaches at University Gaston Berger in Saint Louis in Senegal. By training, Sarr is an economist, but he influenced very largely also debates within the social sciences and within the humanities. In his lectures and academic research, he focuses on questions of epistemology, of economic policies, and the history of religious ideas. In 2018, Sarr and French art historian Bénédicte Savoy published a report on the restitution of African artifacts taken by France during the colonial period entitled Restituer le patrimoine africain. And as many of you probably know, this report has provoked large debates much beyond France and also in Germany on objects in museums and especially on their possible restitution. As a writer, he has published both fiction and scholarly work, among them the novels Staatliche, 105 Rue Carnot, Méditation africaine, and also his recent manifest, Afrotopia. In Afrotopia, which is probably his most renowned work, Sarr calls for new ways of thinking about the relationship between knowledge and development. Particularly, he advocates to go beyond a linear way of thinking that originates in the West and to articulate visions of the future in which pluralities of knowledge coexist and each in their own right. He also underlines the importance of getting rid of the myth of unidirectional development and progress in order to open up a space for Africans to become actors of their own history and architects of their own future. Sarr's most recent research project that he conducted at the Institut d'études avancées de Nantes until last year is entitled Writing Humanities from an African Perspective. And in this context, he calls for an epistemic shift by underlining the necessity to incorporate the complexity of African social structure into scholarly ways of thinking and also to embrace them in their cultural and historical distinctiveness. He also advocates a decolonization of the mind, which can open up for new modalities of understanding the world, which are yet to be explored. So I think we're all very excited to hear now and to listen to the talk by Felwine Sarr. We are very grateful, Felwine Sarr, again, that you accepted our invitation to deliver this first Berlin Southern Theory lecture. And please now I invite you to welcome Felwine Sarr to the stage.
I want to start by saying the great pleasure and honor I have to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I want to thank all the organizers of this series of lectures. I will not talk about museum and restitutions. This night I will talk about, writing the humanity from an African perspective, and I will be more concerned about question of knowledge, epistemology, and how to open and widen the scope of what is knowing. So don't be afraid. In Afrotopia, my purpose was to rethink the category through which the presence of the African continent was depicted, and also the teleologies that were proposed to African societies since the independence of African countries in the 60s. And my main idea is that the future is always open and can be reshaped. I will quickly pass on the issue of reopening the futures for African countries based on their own mythological universe. What I want to do in this lecture is to dig deeper the question of an epistemic shift I have just mentioned at the end of Afrotopia. If you look at the African continent from Algeria to South Africa, the African continent is a site of diversity of cultures, of geographies, ethnic groups, modes of social and political organizations, temporalities and historical depth. But despite this diversity, which is, I think, one of the most important resources of African countries, all the African nations have to confront the same historical challenges. They all share the project of emancipation and improving their well-being, their social well-being. And the African continent, especially in the domains of education, health, economic welfare for the populations, political stability, or human security in some region, face important challenges. Solving the political, the social, and the economic imbalance and satisfying the fundamental needs of the African societies is an urgent task for all African societies. But beyond these important challenges or tasks, not being trapped in a project of only responding to bare necessities is, from my point of view, crucial. A civilization is not only based on material values, but it's also achieved by spiritual, philosophical, and ethical value that give it sense and direction. And it's about, for me, being able not only to view the African continent under the modality of a problem to be solved, but also as a project. This means decrypting the social forms that are produced by its societies, the quality of human, cultural, institutional relationality, the dignity of the everyday life, the multiplicity of scenes, and the profusion of significations of African societies. And I think that social change is deeply linked with the production of narratives and how a human group or a society represents and projects itself. Which goals did it want to achieve? Which values are on the top of its scales? Solidarity, inclusion, competition, etc. Nevertheless, what the African continent is suffering, from my point of view, is a deficit in the thought and the production of its own metaphor for the present and the future. It's my point in Afrotopia. Africa, I think, needs an autonomous and an endogenous teleonomy resulting from its own reflection on its present situation, its fate, and the future she decided to provide for itself. Since 1950, the African population has grown tenfold. Actually, 1 billion people are living in Africa, and in 3 decades, the African will exceed 2.5 billion people, and it will represent 25% of the population of the globe. And the youngest human being will live in Africa. In 2100, African will be more than 4 billion and will represent 40% of the population of the globe. In terms of economic resources, 1/3 of all natural resources are in Africa, and 60% of arable land as well. The economic growth of African countries is faster than the global average of all the countries these past 20 years. The actual demographic trends that experienced by the African continent are interesting to analyze, not only in terms of fear of what some call the P-bomb, but in terms of social, political, and civilizational implication for the world. In less than 1 century, the African continent will be the center of gravity of the world's dynamic. All these reasons explain the regain of interest by European, by Chinese, by American, by transnational companies around Africa, its resources, its land, its middle class, its markets, etc., etc. For me, the most important question is not the question of economic resources or market or lands, but what type of societies, what type of equilibrium between economic and ecology will African countries promote? What type of civilization will they settle? And for me, the African continent could be a laboratory of a new world to invent or create by learning from the failures of the industrial adventure of the last centuries, by rethinking the equilibrium between economy and ecology, the place of culture in the social dynamics, by rethinking the political organization in society in search of a deep democracy. In this context of the necessities of production of new forms in all the domains of social and political life, the issue of knowledge production is crucial. Not only because the African continent has challenges to face in the era of economy based on knowledge and innovation, but knowledge production sustains and reproduces a political, an economical, and a social order. And in order to imagine or construct different futures, it's necessary to interrogate the enunciation of knowledge paradigms. And the epistemological questions can you help me? I want to have place to bring this. Okay. Thanks. So, excuse me. No. It's okay. It's okay. So the epistemological question of what type of knowledge are, how are they produced, for which purpose are fundamental for Africans in their struggle for political, cultural, and economic emancipations. In the recent history of the African continent, the ethnologic knowledge produced on African societies plays a critical role in its domination by European countries in the colonial period. Knowledge has always been linked to power, domination, and coloniality. African societies experience epistemic violence by European settlers. The latter systematically undermine their languages and their production of signification in all domains of social life. Knowledge allows a control or a regulation of the understanding of the world. In that sense, knowledge can be seen as a space of power and coloniality. To think properly the challenges that are actually facing African countries, I will first interrogate the geopolitics of knowledge in the context of Africa. And in the first part of my lecture, I will do a genealogy of what Valentin Mudimbe has named the colonial library, and emphasize the role of this colonial library in the African contemporary positionalities. And in the second part of my lecture, I will particularly emphasize the necessity for Africans to engage an epistemic shift by widening the vision of what knowledge is and by reactivating resources of knowing embodied in their culture, but more specifically by producing new knowledge that will be useful for the future of African society, but also for the world in general. I will also elaborate around the idea of an ecology of knowledge, where disciplines, approach, and methodologies are considered in their own integrity, but put in an ecology where they can interact and produce new knowledges. The corpus of knowledge about Africa, or the ancient corpus, is largely marked by colonial ethnology and anthropology. Valentin Mudimbe named this corpus the colonial library. Since the 15th century, the landscape of Africa has been structured by discourse, whose objective was to physically dominate the land, to re-educate the mentality of native inhabitants, and to integrate the local economies or the local economic histories in the Western perspective. These various forms of knowledge were principally motivated by the objective of governmentality, and whose goal was the justification and the establishment of the colonial enterprise, view non-Western countries through the prism of cultural superiority and racial prejudice. Unfortunately, they continue to largely influence the perception of the African reality and have become an element of the perpetuation of domination or dependence. In fact, maintaining an economic asymmetry between the colonies and the metropole implied that the latter exert an absolute political control over the colonies. And yet, this control would have been impossible without largely shared beliefs in the cultural dominance of the colonizers. It was of vital importance for the colonizer to establish this sense of superiority, to not simply conquer the land and the resources of the colonies, but also their culture as well as their heart and their minds. As a result, the economic and the political injustice that is inherent in the colonization adds one more layer of cultural injustice. This process is called by Rajev Bhargava epistemic injustice. It took place in the same way in India and in African countries. It starts, this epistemic injustice, when concepts and categories, thanks to which a people or a community understand itself as well as its universe, are replaced by the concepts and the categories of the colonizers. And in the colonial context, the system of meanings and the categories of dominant people have been replaced by the meaning and the categories of the colonists. And this has been done by a denigration of the values of the local communities, as well as their production of knowledge. And this process of interiorizing the cultural and the epistemic frameworks belonging to colonized people, it first deployed within the discourse of the colonizer, and they became crystallized within the theoretical work, ethnology, anthropologists, carried out by the colonizers. For Valentin Mudimbe, Kwasi Wiredu or Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for Africans to deeply recover their sovereignty and their fecundity, it's urgent to address the question of the liberation of African discourse, the philosophical discourse, the literacy, and the scientific discourse, by establishing what they call African social sciences. And for these thinkers, it's important to become the subject of one's own scientific discourse. There is therefore a necessity of performing a radical transformation of the social and human science as they are currently taught in African universities. Nevertheless, escaping the reproduction of a mimetic teaching required that some necessary preconditions will to be met. First and foremost, it requires a comprehension of the current modality of the integration of Africa within the myth of the West. And this reconstruction project requires reworking the social science, starting with the epistemological interrogation concerning the object, the methods, and the status of knowledge produced by human science and social science as they are applied to African realities. For Wiredu and Mudimbe, in order to finally escape from a scientific alienation that is constantly lying in wait, African researchers must take on the responsibility of a thought by establishing a scientific discourse that would be the expression of the material life within their own socio-political context. This activity of thinking must root itself within the present, placing a careful attention on its own specific archaeological environment and the real tendencies of Africa's various societies and their most complete and concrete expressions. It's a question of integrating the true complexity of African social societies and no longer considering them as mere carbon copies of Western history, but having their own cultural and historical specificities. Mudimbe wondered if the desired African discourse could be achieved by replacing European languages by African languages, changing the linguistic instrument of knowledge and scientific production could produce an epistemological shift and open up a much needed pathway toward a new adventure in Africa, in the same way that by transplanting into their languages the methods, techniques, and use of knowledge received from Egypt, the Greek triggered a reorganization of knowledge and life whose essential order is still in development. African languages would not only allow for the decolonization of minds and imaginaries, but also would reveal the interiorities and signifying universe inscribed within an order of the world that intimately shapes meanings for African. Languages open up universe and galaxies and world one must explore. And for them, African languages are privileged entry points into taking care of managing the culture in question, as well as their content in terms of thought and form of knowledge. And the work of Bénédicte or Wittgenstein has provided evidence for the link between thought and syntactical and grammatical structure of languages. This point is very interesting, but it's not my main point. The epistemic shift I'm calling for is not just a better application of Western social science, the so-called humanities, to the African realities. One of the arguments is to say we have to inculture or change or better apply the Western social science on African realities. My first point is that we must acknowledge first the diversity of mode of approach to reality according to civilization and epochs, the plurality of modes of knowledge, as well as museological and epistemological relativity. The plurality or disparity of human thought depends on recognizing the equality of the different traditions of thought. It's not about trying to integrate all the traditions of thought in the scientific canon, but to recognize their equality of principle. It's also take note of sometimes, it's not always the case, their incommensurabilities. I will come later on this notion. And this would probably lead us to consider different traditions of thought from their own horizons and the territory, and probably most important, from the configuration of the thinkable they propose. Every tradition of thought proposes a specific configuration of what is thinkable. Thinking about these issues of recognizing the plurality of tradition of thought or way of knowing in the African context call for a deeper epistemic shift, and a shift that will integrate the complexity of African social formation and assume them in their cultural and historical specificity. And for me, it raised the question of the displacement within the fields of constitute knowledge and an act of thought which pays a particular attention to its archaeological milieu and to the real tendency of the society it apprehends. But more fundamentally, the epistemic shift I'm arguing for is about accessing a deeper knowledge of African societies and culture based also, not only, but also on their own museological criteria. And I'm building here on ontology. For that reason, it's necessary to take into account modes of apprehension of reality that are not those linked to scientific knowledge as it has been constituted until now. The study of relatively unexplored territories like the ontomythologies of African societies open up to a better understanding of various knowledge which has ensured the sustainability of African societies. If we consider that African societies are the more ancient social formation of human history because life was born in Africa, it's obvious that these social formation, they sustain themselves in the long duration of history because they have transmitted knowledge and a cultural matrix and a cognitive capital that help them to sustain themselves. So this research on this new or this different way of knowing or this epistemological plurality is an ongoing process, and I have started this research by articulating a history of ideas in the Sahel because it's a region that I'm familiar with, and by choosing the Sahelian region to start this work, this research, my ambition was to reduce the field. Africa is too vast, it's too diverse, and to build a methodology that I or one can rely on for further similar researches. So, to start a history of idea in the Sahel, it's necessary to begin by emphasizing that, contrary to a false common idea, African intellectuals have written extensively on the socio-political realities and cultural dynamics of the African continent, producing a noteworthy library of critical and reflexive writing, as well as significant historical, juridical, and theological texts. Focusing on the Sahel, my research described dominant currents of thought and examine how intellectual habits, as well as social and cultural practice, have been transmitted from the early thinkers to contemporary intellectuals. How, for example, do contemporary African intellectuals engage with a conception inherited, for example, from the Ethiopian philosophical tradition written in Amharic during antiquity, or the 17th century's reflection generated by Ahmed Baba and the members of the Songhaite elite in Timbuktu. To do so, I first consider the particularities of the Sahel as a specific area of production and circulation of ideas. Then I identify and analyze the intellectual genealogies and the social-cultural convergence of the region. In doing so, I pay a specific attention to the process that led to the constitution of dominant current of thought, despite the ethnic diversity and the mobility of the population that characterize the regions. I investigate the particular role Islam has played in this dynamic, and further examine the legacy of an earlier matrix of contemporary thinkers such as Amadou Hampâté-Bâ to outline an history of ideas in the Sahel. A second aspect of this research is to go beyond written texts and to explore the resource of orality. For this, a different methodology is needed to build on resources of orality and diverse archive, for example, by exploring the history of mentalities as they are expressed in a topography of a social discourse. I will come back later to this methodological issue. My second concern is to build an ecology of knowledge where disciplines, approach, and methodologies are considered in their own integrity, but put in an ecology where they can interact and produce new knowledges. While accepting the idea that knowledge is derived from experience, the notion of an ecology of knowledge looks to a much broader concept of experience, a concept that is consonant with a more dynamic ecosystem vision of the world, and probably the possible relevance of a psychic dimension in the Earth ecosystem has been given attention in serious scientific inquiries. Margarita Bowen, the Australian historian of science, who suggests in 1985 the word or the term ecology of knowledge, emphasized that all ideas or actions that issue from observation are themselves incorporate and part of a global ecosystem. They are not separate of the ecosystem. And this evidence suggests a radical break from the established and positivist model of exact to scientific method, in which the scientist is or was regarded as being detached, intellectually at least, from the object of observation, and so able to collect reliable data or objective facts by sense perception analysis to ensure accuracy. David Lowenthal argued that perception is not just a matter of sense alone. Sensing, thinking, feeling, and believing are simultaneous and interdependent process. The question that we might ask ourselves could be this one. Can we enlarge the notion of perceptions? Can we envisage an epistemology of the sense? What do non-discursive way of thinking teach us about reality? Can we consider arts, dance, theater, and bodies as sites of knowledge, of valuable knowledge? And the idea for me is to recognize an epistemologic pluralism which acknowledges the particularity of science and its efficiency in some domains, while contesting the pretension of science to the monopoly of truth and its aim to disqualify other forms of knowledge. And the aim is not to attribute the same value to all types of knowledge, but to allow a pragmatic discussion between multiple criteria of validity of different knowledges. And this discussion should involve academic and non-academic that are both involved in knowledge productions. And the idea is not to immediately disqualify knowledge that are outside of the scientific canon. It means allowing a constellation of various types of knowledge that interact and that are complementaries. Knowledge that can be translated one into another, avoiding the fragmentation and the non-communicability of the multiple types of knowledges. And furthermore, this entails going beyond the idea that knowledge are situated or exclusively depend on the condition of their productions. Human intelligence lies in our ability to go beyond the various possibility of thinking, to understand these possibilities and generate dialogue between them. And the aim, however, is not to bridge the gap between these different approaches to knowledge and reality with a unitary or a convergent dialectic. An ecology of knowledge will not be a systematic research for the ultimate truth, but rather an attempt to present them these possibilities in order to produce something intelligible and useful from their encounters. And the ultimate goal or objective of an epistemological shift is the construction of a library that encompasses all the libraries of the Logos epistemology, the libraries of the non-Logos epistemologies, the anti-colonial libraries, the colonial libraries, the post-colonial libraries, the decolonial, and various archives, thoughts and knowledge that are disseminated in societies. And this library enables the production of new knowledges and new way of knowing, as well as an integral recognition of ignorance. Ignorance embodies what is ignored, what is not considered as knowledge, ignore it, but also what we don't know yet. And the space of ignorance is therefore a space of creativity and innovation, and probably the most important space in the desire of producing knowledge. To also build an ecology of knowledge, we can rely on literature and or cultural studies, in that sense that they can be interesting sides of ecology of knowledges that focus on various aspects of civilizations: knowledge production, art, culture, history of ideas, and mentality. In La Leçon, Roland Barthes proclaimed that if there is one discipline to be saved, this discipline is literature, because in it, all types of knowledge are present. In a literary text, you have an historical, a psychological, a geographical, a social, a technical, and other knowledge are present. And literature is encyclopedic in that sense. Furthermore, literature doesn't fix or fetishize any of these knowledge, but rather give them an indirect place in the work. And by trapping knowledge in the infinite machineries of reflexivity, literature points out possible and unsuspected knowledge. And literature works in the entities of science, and the knowledge it embodies is neither complete or definitive or last. And literature does not say she knows something, but she knows about something. And here lies its power, taking meanings to a strange and foreign territories. The Afro-diasporic literature is experiencing a new vitality, actually. And this literature has its classics that have mainly explored social and political preoccupation of Africans in the context of the struggle for emancipation around the independence. And this classical African literature is, for the contemporary era, an important archive of the history of idea in African countries. Some will even say a counter-archive. This literature, born in the 30s, those literary practices were from their beginning the bearers of identity, of cultural and political claims, and it has played an important role in expressing the experience of people, their existential question, or their political ideas. It pioneers, who became its classic, inscribed the African experience in the symbolic landscape of the word letters, and claimed the expression of imaginaries rooted in the experience of African people and cultures, still under the yoke of colonization. Senghor, Chinua Achebe, Mohamed Dib, Amadou Kourouma, Mongo Betty, Cheikh Hamidou Kane, Wole Soyinka, Kateb Yassine are some of these classics. Mongobeti and Achebe update the cruel universe of colonialism. The work of Alioune Fontouré and Nkrumah highlighted a diffuse malaise linked to the disillusionment born from the experience of independence. And this literature emerging in and around the independence movement was importantly a site to disqualify the calamities and disaster of post-colonial situation by imagining counterfactual realities. The generation of writers that followed the independence era had a strong presence of female authors, Mariama Ba, Aminata Sofal, Ken Bugul, who in addition of a social critic bring issue related to gender and women's emancipatory struggle in the context of African societies. This African fiction has largely contributed to the construction of an archive that is built against the image conveyed by the colonial library and all the knowledge that had contributed to some invention of Africa. And this counter-archive developed new literary representations that participate in the process of emancipating from the colonial library. An author like Kamel Daoud, an Algerian author in Merceau counter-investigation, is pursuing this project today. A new generation of Afro-diasporics authors have emerged: Léonora Miano, Alain Mabankou Samichak, Mohamed Mbougar Sarr. Even if some of the key issues of our time are echoed in their production, this one mostly deal with aesthetics and existential questions, identity, hybridity, and this literature witness a broader landscape of imaginaries. These authors are multi-located, and their literary production is a space where they claim and assume a cosmopolitan identity and a multi-presence in the world. But literature, history of ideas, of mentality, cultural studies also can be seen as an ecology of knowledge. And the objective of an history of ideas or mentality is to study the concept of the world and of life in society, widespread, these notions that are widespread throughout culture, which are expressed in place other than established knowledge and philosophies. In that perspective, African cultural studies could become a multidisciplinary enterprise that explore both literature, of course, as well as canonical knowledge, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, but also the arts, the collective belief in their refined or in their simplistic version, in their literate version or not. And the ambition of such an ecology of knowledge could be in synchrony and diachrony, to study the life of ideas or the historical variation in the response to fundamental human questions that are expressed in the collective thinking of a large group of individuals. Therefore, proceeding to an history of ideas or reflecting on social transformation and knowledge and cultural production of a linguistic era necessitate an understanding of the global environment that produces meaning. This is justified by the fact that some philosophical statement or some legal or scholarly conjectures or literary process or recurrent poetic images only really take meanings when they are connected to each other in the interactive topography of the entire social discourse. And such a meaning of this topography of the entire social discourse cannot be perceived by only sectoral studies practicing a division of labor in some for this regime of discipline or knowledge. Therefore, an history of idea must go beyond the analysis of determined discursive fields and genres philosophical, religious, scientific, literary, political, etc. And leading such an undertaking in the context of African societies or countries raised the question of the source, and in particular, the question of the oral source or archive, carrier more than any other, from my point of view, of the collective memory and the belief of African societies. It should be remembered at this point that West African societies and African societies in general have experienced writing systems that have played differentiated role in archiving and conserving their cultural heritage. Some writing systems were reserved for an elite, others were more widespread, but it's not the issue about writing or orality. For us, for me, it's a matter of moving away from the scriptural paradigm, which sees writing as the exclusive means of transmitting the collective memory or the cultural heritage of a nation or people or communities. Many human groups did not need writing to transmit their cultural heritage throughout history. And there is no human group without language and without a codified means of perpetuating its collective memory through time, therefore without means of exchanging texts at a distance. And West African societies has produced a cultural and a cognitive patrimony that has enabled them to ensure their long-term survival. And to mobilize it, it's necessary to explore their arts, their languages, which includes oral tradition, cosmogonies, myth, and diverse cultural expressions, their ontomythologies. And it's about questioning these cultures through their own categories, that is, through the process they have mainly used to transmit their collective memory. An authentic history of ideas in the African context, in addition to exploring written sources, can't avoid such an approach. The Senegalese philosopher Moussé Diagne shows that African societies, although not ignorant of writing, have developed what he calls an oral reason. He analyzed the latter by highlighting the process, the method of production, preservation, and transmission of knowledge in a context of orality. In his critique of an oral reason, he highlights the discursive process at work at the heart of the oral speech or discourse, and reveal the intellectual laws and process that organize its writings. Writings seen here as a fixation for a transmission of a discourse. So there's a writing of orality. And these processes are different to those found in a scriptural civilizations. And beyond the work on the mechanism governing the production or the archiving and transmission of individual and collective knowledge, Moussé Diagne led a philosophical reflection on the content of these thoughts. And this work highlights the plurality of mode of production, but more important, of archiving knowledge, and questions the exclusivity of a logocentric episteme, as well as the capture of reason by the only mode of written thought. This method of fixing the collective memory are not exclusive to the Sahel or West African countries or African countries. They are those of all societies where the vehicle of a communication of thought is mainly the verbal and not the written. Therefore, the questions of archives and libraries on which are based the cultural studies is absolutely important and crucial. And artifacts and objects can also play a significant role in an archaeology of knowledge because they embody knowledge. They can help the rewriting of history. They encompass knowledge and indicate alternative epistemological or plural epistemological universe. as a space, West African countries, or more precisely the Sahel, is a home for several civilizations. It's a place of superposition, competition, collusion, dialogue, synthesis of several libraries and episteme. Using Mazroui's terms, this space, the Sahel, could be seen or characterized by its triple heritage of Black African cultures, of Islam, and Western cultures. And the contemporary Sahel is the product of the interaction of these three sources of civilization. Its elite is equipped with various kinds of knowledge and trainings, and is able to articulate a double or a triple episteme in their discourse. And what characterizes the Sahel is its ability to project a contemporaneity made of several discursive regimes combined with a multiplicity of repertoire of knowledge. And to understand such a space or an ecology of knowledge built on a plurality of ways of knowing, an archive is needed. It's absolutely impossible to understand this space without building a plurality of way of knowing and without relying on a plurality of archive, written, oral, bodies, art, etc., etc. The question for the researchers is how to decode reality and also understand its evolutions, how to study the meanings generated by human cultures from an historical perspective, but also how to study their evolutions. Every society, every culture, every civilization transmits an heritage and perpetuate a cultural matrix that convey its identity through time, but also this identity is transformed and evolve as the world evolves. And the question is how to characterize this transformation of the cultural matrix of human groups. It's a question that is relevant for African societies, but also for European societies and others. The work or the task we will set ourselves will be to study in the context of West African countries the element of this dynamic cultural matrix, its various components, beyond the analysis of the constitution of the filiation and intellectual traditions. We will also look at the process of meaningful metamorphose within a culture. This raised for me the question of how civilizations are transformed. Are they transformed by internal movement or by reception and integration of external influence? It's a part. And in order to study the history of the transformation of cultural matrix, it will be necessary for us to use transcultural studies. Thank you for your kind listening.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. It is now my big pleasure to invite Professor Kai Kresse to the stage, who is an anthropologist and a philosopher. He is Professor of Social and Cultural Anthropology at Freie Universität Berlin and also Vice Director of the Leibniz Zentrum Moderner Orient. Kai Kresse has contributed largely to debates on Southern theory and epistemology, especially with his work on intellectual traditions on the Swahili coast. His publications include the monographs Philosophizing in Mombasa, Knowledge, Islam, and Intellectual Practice on the Swahili coast, and also his recent book, Swahili Muslim Publics and Post-Colonial Experience. So we are very excited to hear your response to the talk that we just listened to. And after this response, we will have a short exchange on the panel and then open up for your questions from the audience. So Kai Kresse, welcome to the stage.
Good evening. Am I audible? Yeah, it works well. Yes, good evening, and thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. I first want to say that I'm extremely happy for this occasion to be taking place this evening. Also, looking at my own background as someone who first studied philosophy and African studies from the early 1990s onwards, reading some of these thinkers that Felwine Sarr was outlining here for us today. And it is also my pleasure to be, in a way, part of both the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology here at the Free University of Berlin and the ZMO, who are jointly organizing this. And at ZMO, we also have a lecture series which is zooming in on the theme of the thinkers and theorizing from the South, where we have also thinkers from the regions of South Asia and the Middle East. And we are trying to incorporate this into our research program as part of an interdisciplinary research program that works on South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. So, rewriting the humanities from Africa is also, of course, in some ways, rereading and transforming African studies itself, I think. And I think we've seen a very sort of a bold, ambitious outlook and plan for that project here, and a self-situation, sort of a self-positioning of Felwine Sarr within this. But let me also perhaps initially make one statement on the importance or the relevance that can hardly be underestimated of the humanities by quoting from colleagues. In a couple of years ago, the Journal of Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East had a special section on global humanities, also sections on Africa. And in the introduction, Sheldon Pollock made this statement that the humanities anywhere are the possession of people everywhere. And I think this is a very important and significant statement, also pointing at the humanities and what we've heard is connected to it as a resource, so that if we truly understand ourselves as global citizens, if you like, the resources from, the intellectual resources also from everywhere in the world should be made accessible also, should be a potential resource for all of us everywhere. And I think this is a fundamental thought or quote to maybe start off with. And in the same issue, Mamadou Diouf made the point, also looking at this question of resource, asking with a view to Africa and the sort of the diminishing resources or also the downfall of humanities within the institutions. He asked, from where will political and ethical imagination be nourished then, right? If we lose the humanities, we do not have them as a kind of resource to inform us, to, as he says, orient our ethical imagination and provide orientation for these processes. So obviously in this wider institutional and political field, they are kind of central. So this is a fundamental, eminent task that concerns all of us. But I also wanted to mention that we can read this, the first line of your lecture, the rewriting the humanities from Africa, as basically also as a kind of process that has been going on for several decades or for a number of decades already, and on which you build. And so I just, in some sense, wanted to reiterate some of the authors that you have highlighted and quoted here for us, and on whom you build, or on whom we who are interested in the same project also, to whom we refer and on whom we need to build. Mudimbe and his fundamental critique of the invention and the idea of Africa. Kwasi Wiredu, the Ghanaian philosopher, with his diverse iterations of the need for conceptual decolonization. Pauline Huntunji, who from early on in the debate about African philosophy castigated this, what the subfield that he called ethnophilosophy, for what he called extraversion. So in a way, the need to look at an external audience, or to be somewhat enveloped in or entangled in this process of looking at an external kind of Western audience and seeking to please it. And he said, very similar, I think, to your assertive way of claiming we need to push this process of becoming a subject in our own right, and as you say in Afrotopia, to make oneself the epicenter of what is going on. Hontunji calls there for a switch to an introversion, right? To overcome the scientific dependencies that exist on an intellectual as well as on an institutional level. Of course, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, with his emphasis on the fundamental relevance of African languages as a major resource themselves, right? We need conceptual, intellectual orientation functions, works through concepts, through key concepts. And here I think we may also ask, so how can the multiplicity of African languages, the vast multiplicity of that, also be covered and integrated to such a program? And let me mention also Henry Odera Aruka, a Kenyan philosopher who went as an academic philosopher to do fieldwork on local sages, on knowledgeable people. So saying we need to go also beyond the limits of our currently existing practices of our disciplines, right? In order to rewrite the humanities, in order to remind ourselves what the intellectual resources are in terms of individuals and what our particular intellectuals have to say. So he took an active step towards that, but also played a very active role in other debates, making a case for generally a sort of an ethical human minimum, speaking also again with a universalist kind of thrust behind it. And this is, I think, something else that we need to keep on our cards. Just as my former colleague Suleiman Bashir Dian at Columbia University, with his vast diversity of knowledge and experience, is not trying to argue for, a true universalism, a universalism that has to rid itself of its, entanglements in Eurocentrism, but nevertheless, should be inclusive and, in a way, provide visions and perspectives for humanity on the whole. Or, and this is my last one in this line, just Nadia Kasukidi, who works out this program of a Letizia Africana, and in the edited volume that you have out there with Achille Mbembe, also puts her finger on this point of what is perhaps also, what is undecolonizable, right? Especially now also in the current, and rightfully so, the hype about decolonization, which is serious and important and needs to be followed, but also we need to see, how and what form, where are the specific limits, and what are the kind of resources that we can respectively be working with. And this respectively be working with, I think, could be a question to be coming back to in discussion, because I was also asking myself, so what roles is it that we can play, that we should be playing individually, with regard to our disciplinary expertise and our backgrounds, but also where we're coming from, where we're situated on what we're building. And so these were my two sort of pathways in, and I think I should not be saying too much, but maybe I just wanted to flag up 2-3 things specifically from your lecture that I think we should be engaging with and in. This rereading and transforming African studies, which I think is an imminent element here. For me, there's also the project of how your project that you've flagged up here, how it relates to what has been done already. A lot of things have been done, both in West Africa and the Sahel kind of zone, with regard to the particular projects of intellectual histories that you laid out, but also in other ways. So I think it would be for me, it would be very interesting to hear more about how you see yourself vis-a-vis projects of intellectual history in West Africa, for instance, so like Suleyman Bashir Jian or Usman Khan in his new book, but also Karen Barber and anthropologists who work with Yoruba, both in the written and oral contexts a lot. And we have, of course, intellectual sort of histories written in interdisciplinary perspectives. If we look at East Africa, Derek Peterson, or recently on Southern African history, Michael Izzy and others, just to mention a couple of names and also point a finger at other regions. Yeah, so within this big project of the ecology of knowledge, what I found, let me maybe just point at 3 things, and then I have the sense we're kind of pressed a little bit for time. I have loads more, though, if you like. I can add a lot more. So particularly these 2 interrelated things, I thought this, you're coming from this critique of the archive, speaking with Modimbe, and envisioning a sort of a counter-archive. That I would really like to hear a bit more about. And my sense was also that we could connect to this counter-archive also this thinking with concepts, right? Key concepts. Just to give a commonly known example of the Ubuntu, of how that has become, I think it has become discussed so much and from a variety of perspectives that we can really see the value of thinking with it when thinking the world, right? In terms of what the humanities truly should be doing. And so I think, and you mentioned a few other concepts at the end of your book, Afrotopia. So this is to me very intriguing and exciting. How can the counter-archive also work with sort of key concepts? And then related to this library that you envisage and put your finger on that you mentioned. And the double or triple episteme, there I feel intrigued, but I don't, from what you've been saying, I don't quite get it yet. But obviously it seems to also speak to this, the multilingual perspective that we need to be taking when thinking about Africa. How can then several epistemes sort of run parallel to each other, or how can we balance them? How can we sort of treat them as researchers? Yeah. So, and the we in research then, and this is sort of to open up both the conversation and the talk. What kinds of roles is it that we also as representatives or active members in certain institutions can play? What can we do? And of course, me being based in the global north and coming from the global north and intact, my perspective of what we can and should be doing is also somewhat different from there. And how can we change our institutional provisions of the humanities? All of these kinds of questions are also, I think, very practically relevant, right? Not to stick to theory only. So I hope this was useful and not too long. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kai. I think your conversation only among you two could take hours with what you just flagged, the question of zooming out intellectual histories, but also of counter-archives. I would suggest that you just pick on what you actually want to respond directly, because I also want still to leave some room for the questions from the audience. Is that okay? Perfect.
Okay, thank you. I first want to thank you for your readings and your questions, Kay. In what you said, what I've found very important is this idea of that a resource from everywhere must be our resources. And I think the key element of the response is there, this idea that humanity must be based on a plurality of archives. And the archives of other regions or civilizations are also our archives. And it's not just the written archive of Europe or our anthropology, our ethnology, our way of knowing that is only our archive. And if we give a deeper sense to humanities, not anthropos, the European, they create the anthropology, but the anthropos was the other. And they want them to study them as object, etc., being outside. And the genealogy of what we call humanities is far beyond this idea, but this idea that in other spaces there are a plurality of way of knowing, there are a plurality of way of transmitting, archiving knowledge, producing it, and these way of knowing are also our human cultural heritage, and probably we have to broaden the scope of the way of knowing. And for me, this is the way. I think that you are a specific case because you made yourself stranger by learning Swahili. It's made so I don't feel that you are the archetype or of what is being done in the Western academy. So you displace yourself by learning another language, and probably knowing yourself by making yourself stranger is a good way through another language or a translation. You also try to look in poetry if there is philosophy in poetry, if there is philosophy in wisdom, etc. So this kind of displacement open the scope of what is humanity, open the methodological scope, and go beyond the disciplinary. So what have been done, and I will stop with that, by Ousmane Kane and Souleymane Bachdiang is very important because they show that there were intellectual tradition in West Africa, in Timbuktu, written texts, and a huge library and a very important corpus. And this corpus is not only a Europhone corpus. And people around the 9th century and the 10th century, they start writing in Ajami by using Arab letters to write their own stories, their existential question, to write to poetry and the theological tests. And if you want to understand this society, so you have this archive. But what they haven't done is, before the writing system, how society, in a topography of a social discourse, respond to their critical challenges, how society produce meanings on a lot of questions. And if you want to look at this meaning, you have to look beyond, the written library. You have to look in the orality, you have to look in the jokes, you have to look in the arts, you have to look in the landscape, you have to look in a lot of places, and you have to try to interconnect a social discourse in different mode of production of discourse. And you have to change your vision of what a knowledge is. And you have to put the scientific knowledge as one of the possible way of knowing, not just this idea of non-commensurability, etc., etc. So there is a lot to say, but I will stop here to let you open the floor. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this response. And also, I think it could continue this conversation, but I would really like to give the word to the audience. So the floor is open for your questions. Please just raise your hand. We have two persons who will wave, please, so I can see the mics, Jenny and Friedemann over there, and I will bring the microphone directly to you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Felwine. It was hugely inspiring, and I want to start by thanking you and by asking the organizers if and when this might appear online in a shareable way, because I already have in my mind people on 3 continents that I would love to share this with. So thanks for this. My question is linked to what you said about the social context of a discourse, and maybe links also a bit to what Kai said about thinking with concepts. My question is, in your research, how do you enable a communication of the penumbra of meaning, of the deeper embeddedness of a concept in a specific tradition of thought to make it really communicable as something to think with? So maybe by way of example, in my research, I'm looking at indigenous political authorities in Ghanaian contexts. One of these contexts is the Ewe context, in which people are raised with the idea that they are not for, but that there's one sense more than in the European context, the sense of balance. So the sense of balance is inculcated from a young age. When people learn to walk, use your balance, it's addressed, but then later it's also used to address issues in terms of social balance, political balance, ecological balance. So the point is, we can briefly summarize this, but to get to the depth of the rootedness of the concept in socialization, in the way ideas are evoked, would take much more kinds of not just communication, but really an archaeology of the social context. So my question is, what methodology, have you developed or are you using to enable this kind of deeper conceptual communication, not just between the Sahel and the West, but also between different Sahelian contexts and conceptual traditions themselves? Thank you.
Kai was talking about the concept of Ubuntu as a productive concept to understand the relation between the human and the community, and how this concept can be used for a political purpose. This concept is very easy to understand because it's rooted on the same mythological universe than the notion of being a human and building a community. But if you have a notion that is built on an alternative mythological universe, you have first to translate this mythological universe to enable people to understand the concept. And the problem is that there are ways of talking about reality outside of the concept, and the concept is also limited as a tool to understand what is going on. I just want to give a quick example. The notion of ontology, being, is rooted on the Western mythology of the idea of being, l'être. And all the pre-Socratic philosophy has this important question: to be or not to be, what is to be, and all turn around this idea. If you to go to China, Japan, or in some African countries, they don't care about why what is. What is. So they don't ask themselves why there is being instead of non-being. What is important for them is what is livable, what will sustain life. So the idea of being, this ontology, is not the main question, because their way of thinking produce or configurate a thinkable, and the true is not what is true. The true is what operates. They acknowledge that things are here. So how are we going to make them sustainable and livable? So it's always so you can translate concept that belongs to similar mythological universe, but if they are from different mythological universe, you have first to translate the mythological universe. That is a more difficult task, and it's why knowing a culture through its own category, knowing a culture from the inside, is also very important. So, and you have to go through the category of the inside to be able to pick up what mythological universe this notion gave us, and it's starting to become interesting at that point.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Yeah, perfect. Friedemann over there. So we will collect 2 questions over there and here.
Professor Sarr, thank you very much for your excellent speech. I work in intercultural theology and religious studies. And I would like to pose some questions referring to your book, Afrotopia. You have had a lot of questions, I suppose. You refer to spirituality and creating spirituality as an objective, as a target for African epistemologies. And I would be very much interested, what do you understand as these spiritualities, and how does it relate to religion, and how does it help to create an African epistemology? And my second question would be, you refer to the term development as belonging to a cosmology, I believe you say, of the West, as a myth, as a narrative of the West. Do you think we can still use this word? It's a big word in European politics and economies. Can we use it still as a word, or it's like a tool of post-colonial rule? What do you think about that? Thank you.
So these were 2 questions. I will collect the third one here.
Je vous remercie. Je suis malien et ma mère est sénégalaise. Et j'aimerais aussi poser ma question en français. Je suis étudiant ici à l'ATU. J'ai bien apprécié votre discours et les projets que vous menez. J'aimerais savoir où est-ce que vous avez des méthodes pour que la jeunesse africaine puisse s'investir dans cette lutte de la libération. Et aussi ma deuxième question est quel devrait être le paradigme le système éducatif qui devrait être en Afrique, parce qu'en général, tu commences dès la première jusqu'en terminale ou à l'université, on ne parle que de l'Europe. Grandi dans cette condition, on est condamné à avoir un cerveau formaté, aliéné. Et l'Africain se sent complexé. Lorsque je suis venu ici, je me sentais beaucoup plus inférieur à mes amis. C'est après des années que j'ai compris qu'on est tous des humains et que seul le travail mène. Mais en Afrique, la jeunesse est peu investie dans cette lutte.
Thank you. I'm not sure if my French is good enough, but just to maybe for those who do not speak French, the first question was the question for methods for the youth to invest in the fight for liberation, and the second question was about the paradigm, the need for a shift of paradigm at educational institutions. So the floor is yours, Sarr, for the response.
So I will start with the last question, and I will try to answer you. I can answer you in English. Okay. Your second question is the question of the education and the content of education, and I think it's a crucial question. One of the problems of our university is that they are not decolonized. They are perpetuating a system of knowledge and representation that is not turned to solving their social problems. The American university, they imitate the European university of the Middle Age, but quickly they turn their own university to respond to their needs and their issues. The Asian university, they did the same thing. They firstly imitated the US academic, but quickly they turned their university to respond to their society. The African university, most of them were built around the independence, and if you look at the curricula, they have not changed. And for the, I think, 15 first years, there was a lot of European teachers that was teaching sociology, anthropology, Emile Durkheim, etc., based on Europe, and they didn't do the work of Africanizing the social sciences and bringing in the university the knowledge that was produced by the African societies. If you are a young African in the university, and you acknowledge that all the knowledge that is produced is from outside, you can believe that your society have never produced any thought, any knowledge. Because in your university, you will never see in your corpus something that is from your own. And in Saint Louis, we have created a new faculty, a faculty of civilization, art, and culture to bring African languages, African literature, African thought, African spirituality, to give them the dignity of a knowledge and to change the self-perceptions of the young Africans in the university. Western knowledge is interesting, but also something similar or sometimes more relevant in some areas have been produced in these areas. And Africans have largely contributes to a lot of types of knowledge, but those knowledge, you don't find them. And it's important what you have said, because it builds your self-esteem, your self-perceptions, and unconsciously, you feel yourself are someone who came from a space that have no contributions in the human thought, and it's not true. So it's our job to do that, because the archive exists, the resources exist. It's our job to bring this knowledge in the university, to put them in a framework, to criticize them, and to operate a transmission. And it's for me an occasion to answer to your first question. I think the first space of emancipation is knowledge. Deeply, I think that political struggle is important, but every economic and politic order and social is based on an epistemology. And if we don't win the fight of the epistemology, of knowing, of seeing that there is a plurality of words in the world, there's a plurality of way of doing, there's a plurality of resources that we can rely on, you will not change deeply the society, you can just change the surface. And I think that, contrary to what a lot of people think, that activism is the best way, I think first, the space of work is the space of epistemology and knowledge, and it will help to change the production of social forms, of economic forms, etc., etc. And I will try to respond to the word development. Development, if you know the archaeology of the concept, you can say that this concept was born in 1947 after the Second World War, and you will know what was the ideological purpose of trying to bring all the new decolonized African countries in the Western camp, because they were fighting against the East camp, and they wanted to say, look, we can talk no more about civilization because all the problems of the war are here, but our society is a benchmark, and if you want to evolve, you have to imitate the different stage of our economy, of our institution, etc., etc., and they reduce the diversity of the way of responding to need. So probably we can change the word development by using the word well-being, or harmony, or I don't know what, or qualitative progress, etc., etc., or making clear what is the intellectual concept of the production of this notion, and showing that human societies has, during the long history, respond in a plural way on their needs. And the way the European response in a specific context is interesting, but it's not the only way of responding to the needs, and it's not the only goals of societies. So you can pluralize the concept, or you can put it aside. In Latin America, they use buen vivir, etc. So you can produce a concept around the idea that a true development is also have an economic dimension, but have also a cultural dimension, have a link with economy, with ecology, have a spiritual dimension, etc., etc. And spirituality in Afrotropia is seen as the acme, the most prominent, the most important stage of the spirit. Beyond religion, that are, specific response with codes in a specific context. And a spiritual civilization or a poetic civilization is a civilization that feeds all the needs of people, not just the needs of the belly or the lowest needs, that feed all the needs for beauty, the need for sense, the need for meanings, deeper meanings. And probably it's a very important challenge to be able to say that we have to, I don't like the word develop, all the dimension of humanities, and we have to raise or to try to reach a next step in our humanity, a kind of raise in humanity. And all the issues we are facing, ecological issues, but are issues that are rooted in a crisis of sense and meaning. And I think spirituality is seen in that sense.
Okay, so we have the space for another round of questions. Please raise your hands. I hope we managed to see you. 1, 2, Friedemann, one here, and then you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Sarr. You almost already answered my question when talking about activism, but still, at the very beginning of your talk, you said that the future of Africa is determined by this process of forming equilibrium between economy and ecology, and I think this is not only a fact for Africa, but for the whole global society. And I wanted to ask if your project, like rewriting the humanities from Africa, is it like an explicit actor or player also in this formation of this equilibrium? And if yes, what does it mean? Will it be also part of social struggles that determine this this process?
Well, your concern of trying to Africanize higher education, shared by the young men we heard from over there, there is an example for that. there is the International African University in Khartoum, which has 70,000 students. Of course, medicine there is taught according to the colonial precept, because human beings inside with their bladder and their heart are the same all over the world. But in the humanities, the stress is upon African traditions. The students, those 70,000 students, are basically originating from most African countries, including some originally French-speaking, and the accent and the endeavor rests upon trying to understand local specificities, local spiritualities within the local African context. By the way, the language of instruction also is not French, not English, but an African language.
This question of economy and ecology, I think the first stage for researchers is to build a kind of ecological economy, you know, to question the underpinnings and the underlying and the assumption of the neoclassical economy, and probably to reintegrate or to embed economy in a more social space, not thinking economy as a separate order, and thinking a kind of symbiotic economy, an economy that produces outcomes that are not affecting negatively the quality of human relation or the quality of the environment. So I think it's first an epistemologic work. So as an economist that was trained in the main neoclassical economy, this last year I have shifted my research through this question, how to produce a good economy, and what is the deeper philosophical meaning of an economy, and what is the aim of an order of knowledge or an order of, of know-how, and how to just put again economy in his right place and think the relation, the metabolism of the economy produced with its environment. So I think it's the first place to work, because society needs that. They wanted their needs to be fed, but how to feed them by respecting environment, etc., etc. But it's not sufficient. Probably the social fight and the struggle are also important, because it took time from the academic space or the space of knowledge to re-inject the intellectual pre-value in the society, or to change the way the society is ruled. It would be very, very, very interesting, or very, if the society was ruled on the basis of knowledge, but it's not always the case, or on the basis of the new knowledge, etc. So sometimes the people in this academic space, or the intellectual or the artistic, have to wear two hats. They have to do their job at the same time, being activists in the social space to push in the sense they think that the society must go. So the two are not antinomous, but I think that there is a prerequisite condition is to be able to reshape, the vision of what an economy is and what a social form is. I'm very happy to listen to this example. I didn't know that in Khartoum it was such a university, and I think it must be probably a very rare example. And I'm very happy to see that they have integrated African languages in the way of teaching, and also local spiritualities. I just want to add to probably some people who, when they hear this kind of experimentation, they have the fear of a kind of essentialism. These people are not open, they are going to locality, etc., etc. And I want to say to them that when you dig deeper in a specificity, you touch the universality, and it's not antinomic. And digging deeper in some specificity, it can also open the space to be able to dialogue. And if you want to dialogue, if you want to have a real interlocution, you must have two voices that are fully recognized. If you don't have plurality of voices that are recognized. You don't have the dialogue. It's a soliloquy, or it's it's your own. You are discussing with yourself, or you are projecting yourself outside.
Actually, just wanted to add a brief comment that because I think the point cannot be to point at sort of rare or almost singular examples and showcasing them, but rather look at what is the common state of affairs at African universities, but also at our universities, and that's why I was kind of trying to point at in a way I think this was somewhat a programmatic projective outline for a huge collaborative project that you outline here for us. So what is still currently the normal state of affairs in an institute or a department for for philosophy in Africa is 90% of Western philosophy proper, and so that even those 10% should be cultivated regularly. I think this is the kind of, the fundamental discontent that I also experienced last month when I was at an African philosophy conference in Dar es Salaam, where students, also grad students, and people from all over the conference, the continent and beyond came. And I think, right, I mean, this is how do we collaborate on a project of rewriting, meaning sort of transforming the way we use African intellectual culture in its different levels and layers and varieties as a resource for the whole of humanity, but also especially for African students as a conscious resource that they can use consciously and with pride, and where the institutions are built up in a way that this is naturally so, right?
You. So we would have the time for a last round of questions. I see one hand over there. Is this the last one? Did I miss anybody? Yeah, two more questions, and then we will close the discussion with the audience.
Okay, thank you very much for this talk and for having the conversation with us. I actually have a lot of questions, but I'll go with the most urgent one, which is considering that we now heard that this knowledge, alternative knowledge, is there. African voices are there. They have been there since ever, but they're not being heard. Why is it that you consider it most important to focus on the war on mental decolonization? I'm asking because I'm thinking about how our neoliberal system constantly reproduces this coloniality and conceals it at the same time, which leads to an embodiment. So why is our focus not on practice, decolonizing practice, or your focus in this case, but why on mental decolonization? Thank you.
Yes, the question was a bit raised about religion. I'm very astonished that you don't talk very much about it. I think religion is a very important part of nearly every African.
Okay. So would you like to respond to these last two questions, please?
Yes. No, you're absolutely true. Religion is an important part of African society, and I have created the first center of religious study in Gaston Berger in 2011. I've built it, and I've hired professor of anthropology of religion, philosophy of religion, to study the religious dynamics in African societies, and to go beyond Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, to study the African traditional religion, and to study the Asian religion. And I'm also myself teaching Islam, Buddhism, atheism, Christian mystics, etc., etc. So it's a very important concern for myself. But in Afrotopia, it was not the topic for me. It was more a question of modernity, economy, etc., etc., and the idea that we have to open the imaginary of what is a progress, and probably African society must be the subject of their own history, and they must produce what they desire, what is desirable for them. So, but in my literary work, in African meditation and all my work, you will see that spirituality and religion is very, very important. But I just treat it in another space. So it's my response, and it took a lot of time to distinguish religion, spirituality, etc., and to have a sound conversation beyond the question of jihadism, etc. When you say religion, the first idea is jihadism in the Sahel, and it took, you know, a lot of time to say African tradition. So I avoid the misunderstanding when I have a little time, because I know that the question is complex and we need time to treat it, you know, in a sound way. It's why it's easier not to talk about religion if you don't have the real time to talk deeply around it. So I think the both are not antinomic. You can focus on decolonizing practice, but if you don't decolonize the mind, I don't know how you will decolonize the way of behaving. And probably living in Africa, what I've witnessed is what he says. Even if in a department of philosophy, you say 90%, I will say 98% of Husserl, Descartes, Kant, phenomenology, blah, 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 etc., and the reproductions. We are criticizing a Eurocentric way of seeing the, you know, the history of philosophy by not integrating Arab philosophers, Muslim or Japan, or when they come from outside, they say it's thought or it's wisdom. They don't even use the category philosophy. You know, the work of Yala Kisukidi is on this idea that philosophy is the acme, is the most, you know, it's the last stage of the human thought. You know, even if Gilles Deleuze, he said that the philosophy was born in Orient, but it was a little child, and he found his real vitality in Europe with Hegel, etc. But there is a work to do in that spaces. But as far as our curricula are not rethought by ourselves, we will reproduce this way of thinking, or we will rely on a narrow archive. And for me, the issue of decolonial practice is beyond the idea of saying, okay, we are criticizing Western epistemology. It's more saying the Western world has shaped more or less the dynamic of all the humanity these 5 last centuries in economy, in social space, in intellectual space. Probably the Western archive is exhausted because we have asked to this archive a lot. And there's a plurality of archives in the world that are here, that are waiting to be reinvested, and they will help us to respond to the plurality of the challenge we have. We cannot just build all the response we have on a narrow archive. It's my point. So opening or relying on African archives, Asian, Indian, etc., is just opening or pluralizing the solutions and the resources on which we have to build to respond to our current challenges. It's more in that sense that saying, look, we have more resources than that. And if we want to solve our problem, we must build on all our resources. And our resources are also, you know, in African thought, in Asian thought, etc. And probably we must approach them with different methodologies if we want to benefit from them. So this idea of decolonized practice is also linked for me, decolonizing the mentality and the mind, because if you don't do it, how do you change your practice?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the audience for your questions. Thank you very much for this very rich food for thought and debate. Just to come back to the first questions, yes, this is all recorded. It will be available on YouTube in a few days, so it will be also available for a much larger audience. And I would now hand over to my colleague Sandra Calkins for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Hello, again. So I just really want to thank you all for coming, and we were so happy that you're all here. We even had to close the entrance at some point, so you're also lucky you managed to come in. So thanks for coming and for this very lively discussion. I also want to thank you, Kai, for stepping in and for your inputs here. And I also want to thank all in the museum, the many helping hands, and also we want to thank our student assistants who helped very much. A special thank also goes to Kristina, who really kept an organizational eye on many things and many threads that came together tonight. And of course, our gratitude, Felwine, really goes to you. We thank you so much for coming and for taking this challenge and delivering the first Berlin Southern Theory lecture to us. And it really was a wonderful lecture. And there's so much food for thought. It was ambitious and very inspiring to us. So thanks so much for this. So while this is, yeah. So while this is the conclusion of the formal part, we also at the same time want to say we're not concluding the conversations here, they have just begun. So we're actually hoping with this lecture series to really open a space for conversations that will happen over the next few years. But also even tonight, there will be a chance now to more informally continue our conversations, and that can be done over some refreshments. So there will be some wine and some snacks back there. So on that note, let me just say thank you all again, and see you all next year.